So for today's video, we're going to be going back in time 8 months, and I'm going to be playing the week 1 version of Mortal Kombat 1 for the Nintendo Switch, and we're going to be comparing it to the current 1.15 version. The week 1 version that I'm referring to would be in patch 1.3. The main thing that we're going to be focusing on is the changes in performance between the two versions in these 8 months. In addition to that, I've also now got a way to compare frames per second, so that's a big thing that we're going to be looking at. But before we begin, the like button is feeling kinda lonely and would like some attention, so be a dear and hit that real quick. There's a link to my Discord in the description, so make sure to check that out if you want a place where you can find other people to play MK1 on the Switch with. And one more thing before we get started, Mortal Kombat 1 for the Switch is currently on a big sale on the eShop. You can get the premium edition for 55 bucks and the standard edition for 35 bucks. Combat Pack 1 is currently 20 bucks instead of 40. So without further ado, let's begin. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at is the visual changes and FPS changes in the main menu. As you can see, not too much has changed in the main menu, but it does look at least a little bit better. We've got some more visual effects, and there are more of those little butterfly things flying around the screen. The leaves on the trees are more detailed. Loading times do seem about the same, but things change when we start moving beyond that. So since the graphics were a huge point and why people bashed on the game so much when it first came out, let's compare them a bit. Here we see Mileena and Li Mei's intros with Scorpion and Kano cameos. In the 1.3 version of the game, we can see that the game struggles to maintain even just 30 frames per second, often stuttering and at times even coming to a complete stop, and going down to as low as 10 frames per second during the intro. Mileena is missing part of her mouth, and a lot of textures just completely fail to load. In the 1.15 version of the game, MK1 is able to stay closer to 30 FPS, but ever since patch 1.13, there has been a brief pause in the intros. What I think is going on is, if you look right when the intros begin, the stage textures have not loaded completely, but after the pause, they've all loaded magically. So instead of having all these weird slowdowns happening randomly throughout the game, like in patch 1.3 where the game is trying to load everything, maybe the developers made it so that all the textures load during this little pause, because it happens in every single intro at the exact same time, no matter what characters are present or what stage you're on. Now let's take a look at a couple of the fatalities. We'll start off with Sindel's and then we'll move on to Mileena's. With Sindel's fatality, we see again that the textures fail to load. This doesn't happen every single time in 1.3, but the longer that you play the game without rebooting it, the more that it happens. For Sindel's fatality in 1.3, the game targets 30 frames per second, but it's not able to maintain it. Unfortunately, while the 1.15 patch does fare a little bit better in this regard, it still is not able to maintain a steady 30 frames per second during fatalities. Sometimes it also drops down into the low 20s, but the textures not loading no longer occurs in the most recent MK1 Switch patches. That includes 1.15. For the Mileena fatality, I can repeat pretty much everything that I said for the Sindel one. The 1.3 version fails to load the textures, while the 1.15 version loads them perfectly. They both target 30 FPS, but 1.15 is slightly better. So now let's go into a local CPU offline match. And loading from the main menu into the character select screen, it takes about 6 seconds in the 1.3 version, but it takes about 21 seconds in the 1.15 version. Now on its face, that does look pretty bad, but let's take a look at how the character select menu actually performs in both versions. In version 1.3, the character select menu targets 30 frames per second, but it struggles quite a lot in doing so. It often drops into the low teens and it stutters a lot while you're trying to pick your character. But in 1.15, it might take longer to load, but the character menu is a lot smoother and it stays closer to 30 frames per second the entire time. I can cycle through all the characters without any stuttering. In both versions of the game, the character models do take time to load, but the impact on performance from it is a lot less noticeable. Now let's move on to match loading. So for the sake of transparency, I started both timers at the very last frame that the character select menu was visible, and I'm gonna let both versions of the game play out in real time without any editing. As I'm sure you noticed already, the dialogue intros were removed from casual mode and local CPU matches a few patches ago, and I assume this was done to help in the loading times. And as you can see, as a result, version 1.15 loaded in at 27 seconds, while 1.3 is still going. This is actually an anomaly though. Usually I'm able to load casual or local CPU matches in 17 to 21 seconds. This one took 27 seconds. Maybe I should have recorded it again, but I didn't actually time anything until I was in the editing phase of this video. But I'm sure I have other 1.15 intros somewhere, and if I do, I'll include them in the end of the video. But yeah, usually casual local CPU matches take 17 to 21 seconds in the more recent updates. So in getting back to the comparison, it took version 1.3 49 seconds to load the match. Now let's take a look at some gameplay. This is in training mode, so obviously it's offline for obvious reasons. I cannot do these frame rate tests for online gameplay, but this is going to be a good example of how the game runs now. Both 1.3 and 1.15 target 60 frames per second, and for the most part they both stay pretty close to 60, but you will notice more frequent drops in 1.3, but they also occur in 1.15, particularly during animations for special moves. Also, when you call a cameo in version 1.3, the game drops to 30 frames per second and below. This is whether you call an ambush, a summon, or a forward grab. Anytime a cameo is on screen in 1.3, it's going to drop to 30 and below, but this saw a major improvement a few patches ago, which you can see here, where it still drops when a cameo is on screen, but for the most part it stays between 50 and 60 frames per second. But as you can see from this clip in Towers mode, when two cameos are on screen in version 1.15, it can drop to below 30 frames per second, so keep that in mind. Speaking of Towers mode, let's get into the final cutscene, and we can see immediately into loading the match how much 1.3 struggles to keep up with 1.15. I'm gonna let it play out with audio in full quality so you can see how bad it was in 1.3, and then we'll do the same for 1.15, followed by a side-by-side. So as we can see in the side-by-side, the final cutscene in version 1.3 runs extremely slowly, staying below 20 FPS almost the entire time, meaning that the 1.15 version is pretty much twice as fast, way more stable than it was before. It's been improved upon considerably, but it's still not perfect. There are some spots where it's still a tiny little bit out of sync and it might still look a little bit choppy, but when you compare it to what it was like before, it's a night and day difference pretty much. We can also see improvement to the final credits sequence. Before in 1.3, the credits would actually stutter the entire time. This was fixed months ago. So that's going to be it for this video. I'm going to be doing a frame rate test like this for each patch that comes out in Mortal Kombat 1 for the Switch. The next patch is more than likely going to come out with the Homelander update, so we've got a few weeks to wait before that happens, but until then, you guys know what to do. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I am going to keep bringing you more combo videos, online matches, and video game news. I'm Switchplayed. Done. So I've been trying all day, well not all day, but all match to try to land this big ass combo online. Let's see if we, wait, I think we got it. It's not that difficult of a combo to land, but alright, that's the tricky part, and the brutality. Dude, look at the damage though. Look at the damage.